Howdy folks! Welcome to Horseshoes, Hot Dogs, and History, the first video on my series of historic firearms within the game Hot Dogs, Horseshoes, and Hand Grenades. Today, we are coming to you live from the Wild Wild Wurst. We'll be covering the guns that won the West. Okay, let's get started with some rootin' tootin' Old West shootin'. The time frame we're looking at is roughly between the 1840s to the end of the century. It's in these decades that settlement in the American West kicked into high gear, and firearms technology was rapidly changing from the old muzzle-loading single-shot firearms that defined the last few centuries. In fact, we're going to start seeing the beginning of a lot of firearms technology that is still being used today. Despite some estimates putting the end of the Wild West into the early 20th century, for the sake of brevity, we'll be cutting things off at 1890. A lot of technological development happens between the 1890s and 1910s, so that will be covered in a separate video. So, without further ado, let's get started. So of course, when you think of the Wild West, you think of revolvers. Now, it's important to point out that revolvers had actually been around in various forms before the Wild West, but they didn't really come into their own until after the Industrial Revolution, when a guy named Samuel Colt figured out how to mass manufacture revolvers using interchangeable parts. He looked at some of the earlier attempts, mainly the Collier flintlock revolver, and saw that many of these designs failed because the technology of the time simply didn't allow for the precision needed to make a revolver work. Prior to Colt, many revolvers looked more like this. This is an Allen and Thurber pepperbox revolver. Each chamber was also a barrel, because getting the cylinder to line up with the barrel was very challenging. So this is what most designers used in the past. It also made the pistol very heavy by comparison. Colt's big innovation is that he had the hammer also index the cylinder and have it stop at just the right spot for it to line up with the barrel. This was a huge improvement. One other thing worth noting is that all of these early revolvers were what were known as cap and ball revolvers, or percussion cap revolvers. These were still muzzle-loading firearms, much like flintlocks, since they use loose black powder and a lead ball, and then a little percussion cap was placed on the end of the chamber that was full of mercury fulminate, and that percussion cap would explode when it got hit by the hammer. And this is the gun that made Colt what it is today. This is the Colt Walker. As you can see, this thing is massive. That's because this was commissioned by Captain Samuel Walker, with the idea of it being powerful enough to kill a horse in a single shot. To give you an idea of just how strong this thing is, here is a comparison of a .45 long Colt pistol cartridge, which was a very common revolver cartridge. This held only 28 to 40 grains. The Colt Walker was loaded with 60 grains of black powder. so it was only slightly weaker than a 4570 rifle cartridge used for hunting big game. Only problem was, this was brand new technology. Sometimes the user would load this incorrectly with way too much powder, causing it to explode. The later Dragoon model made the cylinder slightly shorter so that you couldn't fill it with as much powder in it. Eventually, Colt began to move away from these monster pistols and settled on more reasonably sized pistols. So they would have a Navy revolver in 36 caliber, an Army revolver in 44 caliber, and below 36 caliber, they'd have these pocket revolvers, much like this Colt Pocket 1849. Here we have an example of a converted revolver. This is a Colt 1851 Navy, one of Colt's most popular revolvers at the time. Originally this was a percussion cap model, but after metallic cartridges became commonplace, revolvers like this one were eventually modified to still be usable. A firing pin replaces the percussion cap seat, but the most significant change is to the cylinder. You can see here, we can open up the loading gate to be able to insert cartridges. And under the barrel here, the ramrod has been replaced with an ejector rod for removing spent cartridges. In between the percussion cap revolver and the cartridge revolver, we have a short-lived evolution called the pinfire revolver. Pinfire was an early form of self-contained cartridge, but these cartridges were notable for having their firing pins built into the cartridge at a sideways angle. Pinfire never really became common in the USA, but they were relatively common in Europe. We have one example here, which is called the Le Fachot. Most commonly known variant was the French military model, which was the first cartridge revolver adopted by any military. Because it was one of the first, demand for this was very high. It would pop up everywhere, from the battlefields of the US Civil War, to the Franco-Prussian War, to even the Boshin War in Japan. For this reason, civilian revolvers using the Le Fachot system can vary wildly, both in caliber and ammo capacity. The military version was your typical 6-shot, 12mm chambering. This one here is an 8-shot 9mm chambering, but some even included an enormous 20-shot version. In the early part of the Wild West, the vast majority of revolvers were single actions. That meant that you had to pull the hammer back each time you wanted to pull the trigger. Compared to today's revolvers, these guns were slow to fire and even slower to reload, as you had to insert each cartridge into this small opening one at a time. One solution to this was the development of the top break revolver. Here we have a Smith & Wesson Model 3 Schofield variant. The Model 3 was very popular around the world, especially in Russia. But the Model 3 Schofield is specific to the US. Because the frame hinges open, you also have a weaker frame, and as a result, these were typically loaded with somewhat weaker cartridges, at least in many of the civilian models. The hinge mechanism would wear out faster than other types of pistol frames, so this type of revolver didn't last long. Colt's first cartridge firing revolver is this Colt Open Top. It looks like a Navy revolver, but this is chambered in 44 Henry rimfire, which was still commonly used in many repeater rifles. You probably never heard of this one because it came out just a year before our next entry. By comparison, the extremely commercially successful Colt Single Action Army was chambered in the powerful 45 Long Colt cartridge, making it a popular choice for cattlemen and soldiers alike. This version in the game is a standard size artillery model and one of the most common ones you'll see. You can learn more about the other variants of the Single Action Army and the Schofield in my first addendum video. Something worth mentioning is that these revolvers were commonly cowboy loaded, meaning that the user would only load 5 chambers and leave the hammer resting against the empty 6th chamber. This is because none of these early revolvers had any sort of safety mechanism. If the hammer accidentally got hit, such as when you dropped the revolver, there would be nothing stopping it from going off. One other quirk of the single action is known as fanning the trigger. You could rapidly fire the revolver by keeping the trigger held and then rapidly slamming the hammer with your other hand. You weren't going to hit anything firing like this, but it's one way to get shots off really fast. One competitor of Colt and Smith & Wesson at the time was Remington, who had their own best-selling revolver called the Model 1858 New Army. Like the 1851 Navy, this was also a common cartridge conversion. But what makes the Remington so special is that the cylinder is easily removable, allowing for quick reloads. Or so the theory goes. First, you needed spare cylinders, which was expensive, and nobody really needed more than 6 shots. It was easier to just carry a second revolver. Secondly, carrying around preloaded cylinders on the cap and ball version was dangerous, because any errant strike on the exposed caps would set off the loaded chamber. This wasn't an issue in the cartridge version, but like I said, it was very uncommon for people to carry spare cylinders. I've heard one person claim that the tolerances wouldn't allow for it on the original version, but I haven't seen anyone really put that to the test on an original model. I've only ever seen it done with reproduction models made with modern machining. But what's interesting about modern versions of these Remington 1858 revolvers is that unless you're using a gate-loaded conversion like this one, you could simply swap between the cartridge firing cylinder or an original percussion cap cylinder. So we mentioned single action revolvers, but what about double action revolvers? A double action revolver lets you cock the hammer and release it on the same trigger pull. It's faster to use, but the trigger pull is also heavier. Double action revolvers were more common in Europe before the likes of Colt and Smith & Wesson began making their own versions. And by the second half of the 19th century, nearly everyone was using them, with the exception of Germany. The Reichsrevolver Model 1879 was a very obsolete design, with it not only being single action, but also lacking an ejector rod. You literally had to poke the empty casings out with a stick. For the rest of the continent, you had more typical designs like this Gasser 1870 from Austria-Hungary, the Bodeo 1889 from Italy, or Webley's Bulldog from Britain. These were all double-action revolvers, but they still used loading gates, so they were still pretty slow to reload. The Bulldog in particular is noteworthy for being an ancestor to the snub-nose revolver, making this a popular compact sidearm. Now let's talk about some truly unique pistols. One of the more famous ones we'll be looking at is the Lamate revolver. This Belgian-made pistol was also widely popular in the Confederacy, in part because it had a 9-round cylinder and a 20-gauge shotgun barrel as well. To switch between firing modes, all you had to do was tilt this lever on the hammer, and it would strike the cap on the shotgun barrel instead of the cylinder. The Lamate was made in a percussion cap version, a pinfire version, and this center fire version. The percussion cap version was the best-selling and best-known, whereas this center fire version wasn't so much of a commercial success. As you can tell, the design is drastically different, in part to accommodate the fact that casings take up more room than just loose powder and ball. The pistol features 2 separate loading gates for each barrel as well. Unfortunately, the Lamate centerfire just wasn't that popular because it's heavy, it's expensive, and you could get a better revolver for a cheaper price. Before lever actions became popular, one way that manufacturers could create a repeating rifle was to take a revolver and give it a full-size stock and a long barrel. Both Colt and Remington made versions of these. This is the Colt Model 1855 carbine. And this is the Remington Cattleman carbine. Neither of these were really well liked because of a particular issue that was common to revolvers at the time. Because there is a gap between the cylinder and the barrel, your forward hand was exposed to fire when you were shooting. If your chamber leaked gunpowder or it was too hot, it was possible for a chain fire to occur, where several shots would fire at the same time. This is bad enough on a pistol, but with a rifle, your forward hand is going to get blasted by fire and shrapnel. Instead, you had to use the trigger guard as a kind of foregrip, like this one here. So yeah, lever actions did the same job but better. One notable exception to this rule was the Smith & Wesson Model 320 carbine, which I covered in my addendum video. Check that video out to learn more about this cool little rifle. Lastly, we'll be looking at some pocket revolvers. This here is a Continental Arms Ladies Companion pepper box. So there's two noteworthy things about this pistol. One is that this is a pepper box revolver, which we covered earlier. Now, pepper box revolvers, as I said, they were usually very bulky and heavy, but on a pistol this small, it really wasn't that big a deal. The second is that because this is a very small revolver, this is what you might call a muff pistol, because it's easy to hide in a woman's muff, or in a purse, or whatever she might have on her person. Lots of small pistols like this were used as easily concealable personal defense, though because of how small the round is, it's realistically only usable at point-blank range. We also have a few pocket-sized pinfire revolvers. This is a Victor Colette pepper box. This is a classic pocket pistol with a foldable trigger for easy storage, a discreet sidearm for someone with a little class. By contrast, we have the not-so-elegant Dolan 1869, which was very obviously made for brawlers, being equal parts pistol, dagger, and brass knuckles. This would actually fold up so that you could use it as brass knuckles. You could also just fold this dagger aside so that it would just be a normal revolver. This pistol is better known by its other name, the Apache, from its association with a French gang known as Les Apaches. Pocket revolvers were certainly a popular choice for close protection, but in the next section, we'll take a look at another common style of compact pistols. So, this is another style of small personal defense pistols called Derringers. Derringers are named after a particularly small muzzleloader, the Philadelphia Derringer, which served in the same role as these other pocket pistols. This is a Remington Model 95 Derringer. It is a break-open, double-barreled, single-action affair. This is a very classic style of Derringer that is still being used today. A contemporary pistol, the Sharp's Pepper Box, is very similar, although the barrels slide forward instead of rotating upward, and you get 4 shots instead of 2. And of course, our list wouldn't be complete without an exotic and completely impractical pistol. This is Haddock's quote-unquote unique squeeze pistol, and it gets its name because this doesn't have a conventional trigger. You'd hold it in the palm of your hand and squeeze this block to fire. These pistols are very inaccurate, very weak, and you're very likely to miss your target beyond point-blank range. But if you had absolutely no other choice, there are always worse options.
I need your clothes, your boots, and your motorcycle.
What?
Hasta la vista, baby.
Let's move on to shotguns. At this time, break-action shotguns are the main shotgun of choice. Most are double barrels, but some single barrels exist, like this Iver Johnson shotgun. Now, at this time, the vast majority of shotguns also have external hammers. This is a holdover from flintlock weapons, since those were all manually cocked as well. Sometimes, though, you see what are called coach guns, which are shotguns with shorter barrels. These coach guns were commonly issued to stagecoaches for defense against bandits, and are commonly associated with the company Wells Fargo, which today is a banking company, but back then was a stagecoach company. It's where we get the phrase, riding shotgun. Now, as for the reason as to why you would use a single barrel or a double barrel, really came down to user preference. On the one hand, with a double-barreled shotgun, you get two choices for loading either barrel, as well as the option of putting different chokes on each barrel, so you'd have a little bit more flexibility. On the other hand, with a single barrel shotgun, you get more accuracy because the sights only have to be lined up with one barrel, not two. So basically, you had different advantages for each one. That being said, break-action shotguns came in all kinds of configurations based on what the user had in mind. These are just the two most common ones. Speaking of which, I got something special I cooked up just for you. Today, 12 gauge and 20 gauge are some of the most common shell sizes, but back in the day, you also had many larger shells in common use, such as 10 gauge or even 8 gauge. This here is an 8 gauge shotgun that I made from a resized 12 gauge. Now 8 gauge was commonly used for bird hunting, to get the maximum amount of pellet spread possible. The reason you don't see 8 gauge commonly today is because after the transition from black powder to smokeless powder, this became overkill and basically pretty much unusable. I mean, this is pretty much borderline as it is. Like, this would just destroy your collarbone. Now, there were developments for repeating shotguns at this time. One of the early versions that we see here is this pump action, or as it was known at the time, slide action. This is a Spencer 1882 shotgun. And as you can see, it generally fits the overall pattern of modern pump actions, but you can see here that the 4 is a little bit small and hard to grip. Also, this is a little inconvenient in that you can't load it without first racking the pump. And because it ejects out of the top, it can break your sight picture. Still, this is a practical and modestly successful repeating shotgun. Another kind of shotgun from this time period is the lever-action shotgun. Here we have a Winchester 1887, one of many designs by John Browning. In principle, it's the same as a lever-action rifle, but loading is a little bit different. It requires you to open the breech first, since this doesn't have a loading gate that you might see on a Winchester rifle. You may recognize this as Arnold's weapon of choice in Terminator 2, but you really need a larger lever loop in order to flip this with one hand. Otherwise, you're just gonna break your fingers. Now, it's worth mentioning that Browning really wanted to make a pump-action shotgun, but Winchester figured that people's familiarity with lever actions would help it sell better on the commercial market. And they were correct. The 1887 was the preferred repeating shotgun for civilians and law enforcement for the next several decades. Pump actions didn't really truly come into their own until after World War I. This is the infamous volcanic pistol. It is by many accounts one of the worst pistols ever made. This used rocket ball ammo, which was an early attempt at a self-contained cartridge, but they were extremely weak and inaccurate. And you couldn't really hold this pistol one-handed either, because this lever action made it too awkward to work the action while trying to grip it firmly at the same time. The Volcanic did come in a rifle version, which had the same ammunition and many of the same shortcomings. Yet despite the Volcanic pistol's awfulness, it paved the way for a very successful rifle. Behold, the Henry Repeater! This was one of the very few cartridge-firing repeaters that saw action in the Civil War. Many of these early repeaters fired weaker pistol-sized cartridges because the full-size rifle rounds used in military rifles were just too powerful for the action to handle. Still, lever actions were quite popular because they were very handy. You could easily carry one while on horseback, and it gave you a good deal of firepower. It was quite common to see someone carry the same ammo for both the revolver and their lever action, so you only had to carry one kind of ammunition. With the success of the Henry, Winchester developed this rifle further, first by changing the loading mechanism from an opening at the front, near the muzzle, to a loading gate located on the side of the receiver. The updated version is known as the Winchester Model 1866 Yellow Boy, due to the brass receiver. While an overall improvement, this still used the same rimfire cartridges as the Henry rifle, and rimfire was starting to fall out of favor outside of small caliber rifles. So Winchester kept developing this model. The next evolution in the Winchester rifle was the Winchester Model 1873, one of the most common lever actions in the West. The 1873 was made available in several different barrel lengths. This is the full-length barrel. There's also a carbine version, and sometimes you'll see people showing off a very short version that is called a mare's leg. This type of pseudo-sidearm was made popular in the Western genre of films, but as far as I can tell, no contemporary models of a mare's leg exist. Still, it's a cool little piece of hardware. While all of the previous models fired pistol cartridges, gunsmiths did eventually figure out how to make lever actions fire rifle cartridges. The first was the Winchester 1876, also known as the Centennial Rifle, but that rifle had its own share of problems, such as not being able to chamber popular big game cartridges. 10 years later, however, a certain mad lad by the name of John Browning came onto the scene and improved the model, making a much stronger design capable of handling new smokeless powder cartridges. This was called the Winchester 1886, not to be confused with the 1866. From there, Browning would continue perfecting lever action designs until they reached their zenith the following decade. While Winchester was the most prolific manufacturer of lever actions, they were certainly by no means the only one. Others worth mentioning include the Spencer carbine, which was another Civil War era repeater as well. Cartridges were inserted through a loading gate inside the stock. But unlike the Winchesters, you have to manually cock the hammer every time before you fire. The lever does not cock the hammer for you. So, despite this being cutting-edge technology at the time, this quickly became obsolete as future models became available. The Sharps rifle, which was also available in the Civil War, existed in a similar vein, albeit this one fired much more powerful cartridges. This one, the 1874 model, is designed with hunters in mind and fires a ludicrously powerful 45-110 cartridge, probably one of the most powerful cartridges you could get. Rifles like this were sometimes called buffalo rifles, because they could reliably kill a buffalo in a single shot. Like the rolling block, this one also features a ladder sight. While this is a lever action rifle, this weapon is also single shot, so all you're really using the lever for on this is to open and close the breech. And like the Spencer, you have to cock the hammer manually, the lever doesn't do that for you. By contrast, the Martini Henry was the military rifle adopted by the British. Like the Sharps, it was single shot, but it is also a very powerful rifle and it has no external hammer, which sped up the firing process a good amount. While by all accounts this was a very dependable rifle that served the British for a long time, it had simply been rendered obsolete, as repeaters were becoming very common in Europe, and attempts to turn this into a repeater as well by including a hopper magazine just didn't pan out. Now you may be wondering, what the heck is this thing? Well, this is a Martini Henry action-based pistol. Now, the British never made anything like this, but these are actually pretty common even today in the Khyber Pass, where a lot of the local gunsmiths make copies of foreign firearms, either very crude ones like this, or even very well-made ones that are difficult to tell from the real thing. I decided to include this because, it's goofy, and I like goofy stuff. You'll notice that our last two lever actions were powerful single-shot rifles. Unlike many of the pistol caliber repeaters, the Sharps and Martini weren't repeaters so much as they used a lever to operate the action. We'll take a look at some other rifles in a similar vein. Remember how I said that most lever actions only used pistol or pistol equivalent cartridges? For the longest time, full-size rifle rounds were only used in single-shot breech-loading rifles. One of the earlier attempts was actually to convert old muzzle-loading Springfield rifles into breech-loading rifles, commonly known as the trapdoor Springfield model. The government thought that they could save money simply by converting existing rifles and adding a breech block and firing pin, but these converted rifles were somewhat prone to breakage compared to purpose-built breech-loading rifles. Later versions of the trapdoor Springfield were more reliable and remained in service until they were ultimately replaced by bolt-action rifles. These rifles used the previously mentioned 45-70 cartridge. While not up to modern standards for a military rifle cartridge, it is still very popular today for big game hunting. Here is one archetypical example of a purpose-built breech-loading rifle. This is the Remington Rolling Block. This was a very popular hunting rifle, and was even adopted by various militaries around the world, being available in many different chamberings. It's very easy to use, just pull back the hammer, open the chamber, insert the cartridge, close the chamber, aim and fire. Remington also made a very accurate, very expensive version for long-range shooting called the number 1 rolling block. This one features a sophisticated ladder sight and aperture. Back then, scopes were extremely rare, usually pretty fragile as well, and difficult, if not impossible, to adjust while retaining zero. Instead, you'd move this ladder up and down to get the correct elevation for the range you were shooting for. Remington also made a pistol version of the rolling block, though very few users actually bought it. The Navy had some interest because back when everyone was still using cap and ball revolvers, this was one of the small number of cartridge firing pistols you could get, which more or less made it waterproof. In Europe, while the rolling block found popularity in many countries, some militaries still wanted to have their own domestic design. One of these was the Austro-Hungarian Wurndl Hullab. Truth be told, it's not a very revolutionary design. This is about as basic as rifles get anyways, but it did stick around until World War I as a backup rifle. The last full-size rifle we'll be looking at goes by a number of different names. This is the double rifle, the Nitro Express rifle, or the elephant gun. This is what big game hunters would use for taking out the biggest of game. You may be thinking, that just looks like a shotgun but bigger. Well, you're half correct. Same basic principle applies between the two, but the walls of these barrels are much stronger than on a shotgun, and they're rifled, so you can actually shoot this accurately at long range. This type of rifle was ideal for hunting really big game, the kind that you see in Africa like elephants. But for everything else, it's pretty much overkill. These big game double rifles would sometimes be chopped down into pistol form as a type of defense against sudden animal attacks. These were commonly known as howdah pistols, as British officials in India would sometimes get attacked by tigers while riding elephants, and they would use these howdah pistols to defend themselves. We do have another, more quirky carbine though. This is the Quackenbush 1886, a single-shot rifle chambered in .22 long rifle. The Quackenbush filled a variety of roles. This is the type of training rifle they'd give to boys due to its light weight and recoil. It's also good for small game hunting, and interestingly enough, these carbines were also intended as self-defense weapons for cyclists. Apparently, there was enough concern among the new bicycle community about getting attacked by muggers or wild animals, so having something like this on hand would be really handy. Of course, because .22 long rifle is such a low power cartridge, it's quite easy to make repeaters chambered in this cartridge. This one isn't a breechloader, but I didn't really have a good place to stick this in the video because of how quirky it is. This is a Winchester Model 1890, designed by John Browning. These small caliber pump-action rifles were somewhat common, especially in different shooting galleries where it was known as the gallery gun. Winchester and Colt made several different versions of this type of rifle, but it's very rare to see pump-action rifles these days, especially with how easy and inexpensive it is to make self-loading rifles in .22 caliber. So, now let's take a look at the type of rifle that eventually replaced the lever action, and the breechloader. bolt-action rifles had been in development in Europe around the same time that lever-action rifles were being developed in America. Their earliest one was the German Dreiss needle rifle. Here we have the very similar Chassepot rifle made in France. What they have in common was that both are single-shot needle-fire rifles. What makes these needle-fire is that they have a large needle attached to the bolt, which is designed to poke through a paper cartridge and set off the percussion cap inside. This obviously exposed the needle to a lot of pressure and would eventually break, but these were easy to replace. You also had to manually cock the hammer, which was a holdover from older rifle patterns. While still not quite up to the standard of modern bolt-action patterns, this was a dramatic improvement in terms of rate of fire. Bolt-action design would continue to evolve with the introduction of magazines. However, how these loading mechanisms were implemented varied wildly. It would take until after World War I before we start to see some form of standardization. You can see here on the Swiss Vetterli 1871 carbine, we see a loading gate and tube magazine very similar to what you'd see on a Winchester rifle. By contrast, we have the Italian Vetterli Vitali 1870-87, which basically was originally a single-shot rifle, but it has been drilled out to have a magazine as an afterthought. Though you also see one of the first uses of top feed clips to speed up loading, something that nearly all bolt actions started using. Also, working the action also cocked the hammer, which improves the fire rate on these rifles. The French eventually came up with the Lebel rifle, the first smokeless powder magazine-fed bolt-action rifle. This rifle still uses a tube magazine, meaning that it could not be chambered with conical bullets for improved accuracy, nor could it use stripper clips. In response, the Germans came up with the Gewehr 1888, which starts to have a lot of features that we commonly see today. This was one of the first rifles to use N-block clips, which was inserted into the magazine in whole and would be ejected after it was emptied. The Brits, meanwhile, came up with their own design, the Lee Metford, as a replacement to the Martini Henry. This rifle has a lot of innovative features, including a removable magazine that offered twice the ammo capacity of contemporary rifles, as well as a quick operating bolt. However, it didn't stay in service for very long, as the transition from black powder to smokeless powder caused many problems in weapon refits, as well as poor manufacturing standards. The improvements to the Lee Metford would eventually culminate in an entirely new rifle, the Lee Enfield. One of the early rifles that got picked up in a lot of places was the Krag Jørgensen, a Norwegian rifle with a side-loading magazine. Krag rifles can't use stripper clips. It was normal at the time to load one cartridge at a time, or even to fire a single round and then insert a new round, with the magazine simply being an emergency reserve for ammunition. Many rifles at this time had what was called a magazine cutoff, which was a lever that blocked the bolt carrier from accessing the magazine. The American military adopted it to replace their single-shot and lever-action rifles, but eventually decided that this feature wouldn't suffice after their experience in Cuba and the Philippines, as it was too cumbersome and underpowered, and went with a more Mauser-style rifle with the domestically manufactured Springfield Model 1903. More on that when we talk about World War I. The last gun we'll be looking at today is a particularly quirky gun of the time period. Before we had auto-loading firearms that used recoil or gas operation, we have machine guns that are crank operated. This is the hand crank Frank, which is a fictional, man-portable version of the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun was developed during the Civil War as an anti-infantry, close-range artillery piece, and was used to great effect wherever it was deployed. These barrels spin as you turn the crank, allowing for the internal mechanisms to chamber, fire, and then eject each cartridge rapidly. A few other countries developed similar guns, such as the Gardner gun, the mitrailleuse, or the Hotchkiss. We still see this kind of mechanism used today in anti-aircraft guns, but those are electrically powered. Before we end the video, we'll take a quick look at explosives. Ever since black powder first appeared, people have dabbled in making handheld explosives with limited degrees of success. Grenades have been used on and off in the era of pike and shot, but never fully caught on, because their use often came with a very high risk of injury. That being said, we do see a few developments in the 19th century. This is a Civil War Ketchum grenade, which uses a percussion cap fuse instead of a wick. This explodes when the plunger, which attaches in the front, strikes a hard surface, ideally after it's been thrown and reaches the ground. Like that. However, it has to hit at exactly the right angle. The Confederates figured out that catching these things with a blanket helps prevent them from going off. That being said, this is such a unique grenade that I wanted to include it. While not a grenade, I'd certainly be remiss to not include it. If there was one explosive that was king at this time, it was dynamite. Made of nitroglycerin, clay, and stabilizers, you had a compound that was safer to transport and stronger than contemporary explosives, making it great for demolitions and mining. The interesting story behind this is that its inventor, Alfred Nobel, decided to start the Nobel Prize when he saw his own premature obituary call him the Merchant of Death, and decided to dedicate his life to advancing the causes of peace, scientific progress, and cultural development. So that covers the guns that were used in the Wild West. The early 20th century was a period of great technological transition, so I left most of those guns to be discussed in our next video on the turn of the century. So, I hope to see you again in our next video. Until next time, meatwads!